afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining us this evening for the first panel of the Meishadia Foundation, Free Connected Minds. We are looking today at a very interesting discussion. This is the first e-conference that they're doing for the year 2020. First, a couple of just some housekeeping orders. I want to apologize for not being able to do this from the studio as initially planned due to horrific traffic in Beirut. So we've opted to kind of do the mix. The other thing I wanted to mention is that today we have a full panel with 4 fantastic speakers. First, we have Dr. Tarek Mitri, who's the former Minister of Environment, Administrative Development and Culture in Lebanon, and also former Director of the Issam Paris Institute for Public Policy, as well as former Special Representative for Libya under the UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon. Also with us today is Dr. Marwan Muasher, who is the Vice President for the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, as well as former Deputy Prime Minister and former Minister of Foreign Affairs in Jordan. Jeff Feltman, who's very well known in Lebanon, who is today the John Whitehead Visiting Fellow in International Diplomacy at Brookings, but is also the former United Nations Under Secretary General for Political Affairs and former U.S. Ambassador to Lebanon, amongst other countries, including Erbil, Baghdad, Jerusalem, Tunis, Amman, Budapest. I mean, he's served in all these places. And last but not least, His Excellency Hoshyar Zebari, who is the former Deputy Prime Minister of Iraq, as well as a former Minister of Finance and former Minister of Foreign Affairs, and is a prominent member of the Kurdish Democratic Party. Today, our theme is the impact of how will the Middle East be affected by rising geopolitical tensions. As you're all aware, sorry, I forgot to introduce myself. My name is Maha Yahya. I'm the director of the Carnegie Middle East Center based in Beirut. As you're all aware, the region is witness to extensive proxy wars stretching from Yemen to Libya, with Iraq, Lebanon, and Syria at least in between. There are significant geopolitical tensions. Just about anybody and everybody is involved in the region in one way or the other. So, Tarek, let me begin with the whole panel. I'd like each of you to perhaps describe in a few words the status of geopolitical tensions in the region and how you see them playing out in the part of the region that you are most focused on or most concerned with. Marwan, if I can start with you on this.
Thank you, Maha. This region has witnessed at least 3 major crises, if you will, in the last decade, starting with the Arab revolutions, what is called the Arab Spring in 2011, the decline in oil prices that has started in 2014, ending or starting to end the oil era in the Arab world, and then COVID-19, which came to basically strengthen and deepen all the other 2 crises. It is clear that the region is suffering from a problem of governance. It is clear that the economic model that has sustained the region for a long time is no longer working. And on top of all that, we also now have the new agreements between the UAE, Bahrain, and Israel, and what that will mean on the future of the Arab-Israeli conflict and the future of the region as a whole.
Thank you. Let me move to you, Jeff. Just a few words on how you see who are the main players and how you see the geopolitical tensions playing out in the region.
Well, thanks, Maha, and thanks to the Meishadia Foundation for including me in this discussion with such distinguished panelists and friends on this screen. Let me pick up where Marwan left off, the Secretary, where Mr. Muasher left off, which is the UAE, Israel, and the Bahrain-Israel agreement. I mean, I think from a Washington perspective, I'm speaking as an American, at this point, our two most important allies in the region are the UAE and Israel. They've now sort of come out of the closet with the relationship that everyone knew had been there for some time. But what concerns me as an American is this relationship over the long run as much in our interest as the Trump administration would advocate? Because I could see a situation where the UAE and Israel joining with others combined to put pressure on us, combined to try to jam us on various issues. We saw the UAE and Israel working perhaps not in close coordination, but for the same goals in undermining the support on Capitol Hill for the JCPOA with Iran back under the Obama administration. So I'm sort of interested in how these alliances in the region will affect U.S. foreign policy at a time when Americans are looking inward, when Americans are not really paying that much attention to foreign policy for all sorts of reasons. But there's another alliance I find interesting. I'm interested to hear what Minister Zebari has to say about that, which are these periodic summits between Iraq, Jordan, and Egypt, talking about building new hydrocarbon pipelines from Iraq through Jordan to Egypt, which could also change some of the economic underpinnings in the region. So I think it's a time of transition, not only in my country, but also transition in the alliances in the region.
Thank you. With this note, then let me turn to Minister Zebari. If you would like to say a few words on the kind of key geopolitical tensions that you see and what they mean for the region you're most focused on. We're going to get into a lot more detail as the session goes on, but I thought we could start with a few remarks.
Thank you. Thank you, Mahar. Thank you for inviting me, also for having me on your panel, and greetings to all distinguished friends. In fact, this topic is very important, and the geopolitical changes in the regions are really moving faster than we react to them. I agree with what Marwan has said and Jeff, but in my view, there is one serious development. The lack of an Arab stance, as we used to live with before, has allowed two other non-Arab countries to have a bigger role in the affairs of our countries, of our region, Iran and Turkey. They have been really far more proactive in their intervention, in their decision, and their policies and so on. This is a new development. The other development, which I think today is, although it may be a historical day for signing the Emirati, Bahraini, Israeli agreement in the White House, but I could foresee really this will increase tension in the region. Although the goodwill of everybody, of Washington, is really to spread the peace, the prosperity, the development, but the adversary really will not be watching. This is my own reading of the situation. In Iraq, as such, we expect in October, before the presidential election, there would be an escalation against American target, American interest, just to embarrass the administration. So these regional players are not just watching, sitting and watching. Really, they are working everywhere, from Libya to Yemen to Lebanon to Syria to Iraq and so on. But I believe that this is a very, very serious development in the Middle East as a whole, and for Israel really to get out of its isolation and open up and to normalize relations with two Arab countries. I think others will follow my own reading. As for Jeff, my friend's question, in fact, this trilateral agreement between Iraq, Jordan, and Egypt has been on the table for quite some time. And the reason behind it is to help Iraq to have a balance vis-a-vis Iranian influence, and for the Arabs to embrace, accommodate Marwan, Tarek. Remember, even during our times, we used to encourage that thinking, but we didn't get much response, really, because of American occupation, because of this and that. So this idea has been revived. Basically, it is economic, as Jeff said, really, to help create an economic bloc between Iraq, Egypt, and Jordan, and to help the Iraqi to find its balance. But again, my view that they will try to torpedo, to sabotage such an attempt to achieve this goal.
Thank you, Hoshyar. We'll come back again to elaborate on some of these comments a little bit more. But Tarek, let me move to you last but not least, of course. If you could say a few comments on the geopolitical tensions, but I also want to kind of perhaps move in a little bit with you and begin with the discussion where two countries where these geopolitical tensions have been most evident are Libya and Lebanon, albeit in very different ways. So can you perhaps say a few words on when you see things moving in Libya, and we'll come back to Lebanon at a later stage.
I'm saying that conflicts, asymmetrical wars, were not frozen, and the appeal of Gustavo Guterres fell on deaf ears in Libya and in Yemen. My last remark is about the effect of COVID on what you may call the democratic demand in the Arab world. I think many people thought that this COVID crisis might give more credibility and to authoritarian regimes, because people seek protection, and then they may think authoritarian regimes are better placed to protect them. But this has not happened either, and one could claim that the democratic demand is being reinforced by the crisis.
Thank you. Jeff, let me turn back to you with a question that I know many in our audience will be wanting to hear your response to. You were ambassador to Lebanon between 2004 and 2008. And during that period, you were often accused of being the not-so-hidden hand in government formation in this country. To this day, people still refer to some cabinets as the Hukumat Feltman or Hukumat Feltman. So I wanted to ask you today, given the context and we're yet once more in a government formation process, but however, as part of a French initiative to help stabilize Lebanon, led by President Macron. So my question to you is, what is the perception of the French initiative in the United States? How supportive is the United States basically of this initiative, especially in view of the sanctions that came out last week and that seemed to have at least indicated that all was not well on that front, and they seem to have destabilized or derailed that initiative to some extent. I'd love to hear your take on this.
Well, thank you, Maha. And I remember when I was ambassador in Lebanon, and I would get up in the mornings and pick up the newspapers and look at the newspapers and be absolutely shocked by what I had apparently said the previous day, at least as reported in the news. But in terms of, if you look back at that period, say the period in 2005 after Rafik Hariri was assassinated and the Syrians decided to pull their troops out from Lebanon, that was a dramatic development at the time. And it happened because there was such internal pressure from the ground up, the 1 million+ people on March 14th at Hero Square, plus united, unrelenting external pressure. led by France and the United States, including many other countries, and this internal, external, inside-outside pressure basically gave the Syrians no choice but to withdraw their troops. Unfortunately, I don't see the same formula at play now. The change that Lebanon needs is far more profound today than simply the Syrian troops leaving in 2005. What's needed is a complete overhaul of the system. And I think that President Macron, certainly his intentions are right in this, and I think he's played a very constructive role. But I don't see the external actors united in the same way they were united back in 2005. You see a difference between Paris and Washington, for example, over how you treat the reality of Hezbollah. You don't see the Gulf, you don't see the UAE and Saudi Arabia being prepared to step in the way that they helped in 2005, 2006, and six. So and most of the world is focused inward now because of the economic decline, because of the coronavirus. So I don't see the external unity being replicated that we had in 2005, despite President Macron's leadership. And internally in Lebanon, I of course defer to you, Maha, and Dr. Tarek, but it doesn't seem to me that same unified solidarity that can be translated into ground roots pressure exists because of coronavirus, because of the need to deal with how you get food on the table, the reconstruction after the port explosion. There's all sorts of distractions. So I'm worried that the change Lebanon needs can come about only with sustained, unified internal and external pressure, but I don't see the conditions in place for that right now.
Do you see them coming into place at some point in the near future? I mean, I will come back to you in terms of should there be a change of a change in the guard, in the leadership in the U.S.
I mean, first of all, if you look at the United States, sanctions are not a policy. Sanctions are a tool, but sanctions should be part of a comprehensive approach to support a policy. And I don't really see the atmosphere in the United States right now being conducive to developing a comprehensive policy toward Lebanon, simply because of where we are in the electoral calendar, simply because where we are in terms of our own internal polarization and divisions. The U.S. support for the Lebanese armed forces has continued. I think but it's always a bit questionable whether that will survive congressional scrutiny. Again, it's related to the whole Hezbollah question. But I don't see a cohesive, comprehensive policy toward Lebanon developing right now in this stage in our electoral calendar. And I defer to you and Tarek and Lebanese friends on the ground as to how you translate the popular unhappiness, into sustained political movement in Lebanon.
Tarek, would you agree with that assessment?
Yes, I do. I do agree. I think it will take some time before the discontent, which is widespread in Lebanon, the total discredit of the political forces that have been ruling the country for decades, will lead to a significant political change. Let me say a few words about the President Macron's initiative. I think in the first stage, Macron said to the Lebanese, you need a political pact, a new political pact. He spoke to the young people down in the streets of Shemaize and said to them, I don't trust your government, nor do I trust your leaders. I want to talk to you and work with you. But then later, the French initiative was so focused on economic recovery, and that is the carrot that Macron has carried with him, was so focused on economic recovery that he was willing to make concessions on the political front. That there might be other reasons why he was very conciliatory, say with Hezbollah and his allies, and with the others as well, probably because of geopolitical reasons in the region, He's apprehensive of a potential Turkish influence in Lebanon. I think it's highly exaggerated in my view. The Turks in Lebanon has some influence, but not as important as the French might be inclined to see. Maybe he wanted to appease the Iranians, but maybe he wants to help Lebanon. He thinks that the best way to help Lebanon is to get the country out of the present economic and financial disaster. And to do that, you need reforms to be voted in Parliament. And Parliament is the time for political change. This is the message of Macron. It's the time of economic recovery and let's postpone for a while until this protest movement that we have seen produces new political elites, becomes a sort of alternative. That will take time. That will not happen in an anticipated election.
Thank you, Tarek, for that. Hoshyar, let me turn to you and to Iraq. Turkey's been quite active. I mean, we're talking about geopolitical tensions, regional tensions as well. Turkey's been quite active in northern Iraq with an escalation in recent attacks. What do you make of those attacks? And in this context of increasing geopolitical tensions, what prospects do you see for a breakthrough, perhaps, between Erbil and the Erbil-Baghdad relations under the leadership of Prime Minister Kadhimi in Baghdad?
Yes, Maha. First, on the Turkish interventions, this has not been a new development, really. We have lived with these attacks or military incursion for many years. And Turkey's main rationale for this is to deter or to destroy the PKK bases in the mountainous region in northern Iraq. And they are there not with the consent of the federal government or the regional government, but in defiance, actually. The PKK have no legitimate reason to stay in our territories, but they are defying that. So Turkey is defining its goal to limited security demobilization of PKK in targeting their personnel, their target, and so on. Recently, our leaders have a meeting with Erdogan in Ankara, which was a very good and open meeting. And we raised our doubt, actually, whether Turkey has any territorial ambitions in the region or reclaiming of the Mosul Vilayat, which is the entire northern Iraq as such. He denied that their goal, their aim is just the PKK, and they want some cooperation between Ankara, Baghdad, and Erbil to address the security issue. But Turkey is everywhere now, from Libya to Syria to Iraq, so nobody can ignore the
Lebanon.
Ignore their role at all.
Limited role here, but still.
Yeah, but on the other reason, with Baghdad, actually, relations are moving very positively in the right direction. The new government of Mustafa al-Kadhimi has a great deal of goodwill internationally, locally, and in the Arab world also. Everybody wants this government to succeed, for the country to be stabilized, to carry out reforms, to fight corruption, to reorganize the security forces, to limit the influence of the militias, of the armed militia, of popular mobilization forces, and so on. He's trying his best. Recently, he was in Kurdistan and he visited all the crossing point, all the provinces, and he was very well received. So Baghdad-Erbil relations now are on the right track, actually, and both sides are working on the unresolved issue, but things are moving in the right direction from that sense.
Thank you. Let me then ask you just a quick follow-up question. You were a key advocate of the independence referendum a few years ago. Do you still think it was the right decision at that time, or would you?
No, the referendum actually was a collective decision of all the Kurdish parties at the time to express their wish, what they want. Everybody knows what every Kurd desire. So it's not a hidden agenda, actually. It's been with every newborn Kurd, you see, to see their own state. But at the time we said, Maha, really carrying out referendum is not a crime. It was a peaceful, democratic, with excellent result. But we said it will not mean the creation of independent Kurdish state the day after. This is a long process. It has to be negotiated. Anyway, it was a decision. We took responsibility for that, and it was there, and the Kurds have voted. But really, the intention was there. It was misinterpreted that this will lead to the breakup of Iraq immediately, which was not the case at all.
Thank you. Let me then now move to turn to you, Marwan, with another hotspot in the region where the current US administration is touting a success. And you've already mentioned this, and others have mentioned it in the opening remarks. And that is, of course, the Israel-Palestine axis, particularly with the recent UAE and Bahrain peace agreements with Israel. My question is, what are the implications of these agreements for peace and stability and for the prospects of a Palestinian state or even a one-state solution? Where do you see this going? And is it really that kind of a stabilizing, will these agreements have a stabilizing effect on the region as they are being presented?
I think aside from the fact that it is clear that these are bilateral agreements between Israel on one hand and either of the UAE and Bahrain on the other hand, that might further bilateral interests of these countries, they are still labeled as peace agreements. And if they are labeled as peace agreements, it is legitimate to ask whether they will further the cause of peace in the Middle East or not. This is the criteria by which we should judge these agreements, not the festivalities that surround them. To me, you achieve success if you end the Israeli occupation of the 3 Arab territories, and if you achieve a two-state solution, that is a Palestinian state on Palestinian soil. If these agreements further that cause, advance it in any positive way, then they are good. But to me, they don't advance it. Not only do they not advance that cause, they actually work to the detriment of that cause. Let me explain why. The Arab Peace Initiative was based on a very important principle, land for peace. In return for land that Israel gives up its occupation of, all 22 Arab states are ready to sign a peace agreement with Israel. That was the basis of the Arab Peace Agreement. Today, Israel is saying, I don't need peace with the Palestinians. I don't need to come to terms with the Palestinians because I can have agreements with other Arab states that are not based on this principle, but rather on the principle of peace for peace. And therefore, if anybody had any doubts as to the slow death of the two-state solution, these agreements are providing further proof that a two-state solution is no longer possible if we are giving Israel the clear signal that they don't have to compromise in any way with the Palestinians and can substitute this through peace agreements with other Arab countries. This is the danger. The other danger that I see is that the Arab Peace Initiative, which already is dying, if not dead, the Arab Peace Initiative, the strength of the initiative was based on the fact that it was approved by all Arab countries, that it achieved
the 2002
the 2002 Arab Peace Initiative.
That was launched from Beirut, actually.
With Bahrain and UAE and maybe others joining, you know, what is left of the Arab Peace Initiative to talk about? So we are today, well, I am judging these agreements by whether they further the cause of an end to the occupation and the establishment of a Palestinian state. They clearly, to me, are not doing that. And therefore, the international community, some of which, of course, is hailing these agreements, because after all, you know, why are we against peace with each other, is what they are saying. But in hailing these agreements, the international community is ignoring the fact that soon, in my view, they will have to come to terms with the repercussions of the end of the two-state solution and what that means to the future of the occupied territories. Palestinians are going to say, and soon, in my view, because they are already a majority in areas under Israel control, Palestinians are going to say, if we cannot have our own state in the West Bank, Jerusalem, and Gaza, and we are going to demand for equal rights. We are going to demand for political rights in the territories we live in. And you, as an international community, cannot keep telling us no to a Palestinian state and no to equal rights. That only means one conclusion: yes to apartheid. You, as an international community, cannot support an apartheid system indefinitely. This is what the international community, what it will have to deal with by, you know, looking at the short-term effects of peace agreements that don't, in my view, serve the cause of peace in any way.
Thank you, Marwan, for that. Let me turn to you, Jeff. Would you agree with Marwan's reading of the peace initiatives? Well, are they serving the cause of peace?
I not surprising. I agree with the wisdom that Marwan has shared with all of us. I think over the what is obviously in the short-term interest of the Israelis and Bibi Netanyahu may in fact not be in their long-term interests if the debate switches from a territorial debate to a debate about rights, for the reasons that Marwan outlined. And I think that much of the Palestinian civil society has already shifted that way. Much of Palestinian civil society on the ground is already talking about rights rather than territory, because they see what's happened with the territory on which they thought they were going to be building a state. And that also basically increases the discrepancy between the Palestinian traditional leadership and the street. The Palestinian traditional leadership and the street I think are increasingly at odds over what should be the next step. But I also wonder, and again, I'm not saying that I necessarily agree with this, but I also wonder if there's a way to use these agreements, which have been announced, which are real, to start trying over the long term to change the attitude of the Israeli public. I think that all of us, I think most of you know I worked in the Gaza Strip for 3 years. I worked in the West Bank for 4 years. So and the time I was working out of Jerusalem in the West Bank was during the Second Intifada. And I think many of us have underestimated what that Second Intifada did to Israeli public opinion. It really turned the Israeli public opinion to the right. And of course, Netanyahu and others have exploited that, have expanded it. But the younger generation that came of age during that Intifada, Second Intifada, went far right. And of course, the peace with Jordan and Egypt were done out of geographic security necessity, but they're cold pieces. It's not a popular peace. And now you're looking at things with the UAE, where you have yoga instructors doing things together, where you have it seems to be a warm peace. It's a faraway peace. Can this be used in a way that starts to change the Israeli public opinion back away from that rightward trend that started during the Second Intifada, that can convince the Israeli public that they need to start electing leaders who can, in fact, make the types of compromises possible with the Palestinians to make a two-state solution? Can you reignite the Israeli imagination about living with their immediate neighbors because they have a warmer relationship now with their farther neighbors? Again, this may be far-fetched, but it's something that I think is worth exploring.
It's definitely worth exploring, but I'm going to stay with you for a second more with another question, a follow-up question, Jeff, before I move to the other speakers, which is there's been much discussion and articles coming out, which I'm sure you've seen, about how the Middle East no longer matters, in a sense, to American, it's no longer a strategic interest as such. And I think in a sense, this kind of started with the pivot to Asia under President Obama, but we're seeing this increasingly, that there is an interest in Israeli security, but the broader Middle East is no longer really that relevant. So today, the U.S. is relevant to the United States. Today, the United States is coming up to a presidential election. Would a change of guard, would a Biden win trigger a more substantive change in policy? I'm assuming it would. What would that be for this region? Specifically towards Iran, I'm thinking Iran, Syria, I mean the entire region. What would a Biden win mean for us?
I think, Maha, I think you put your finger on a general attitude that people feel that we're over-invested in the Middle East beyond what our strategic national interests would suggest is warranted. But I don't think you're going to see the United States departing the Middle East altogether. I think that that there are residual interests that will keep us engaged. I just not in terms of sort of the invasion countries of sort of the Iraq story of 2003, etc. And I think that the UAE Israel agreement, the UAE's decision to go public with its relationship with Israel, was aimed at Biden as much as it was the Trump administration. I think it was because I think that the UAE has realized how invested they are in the Trump administration, and that Trump may not win these elections, and that they don't want to be put in the same basket as, say, Mohammed bin Salman. In terms of Khashoggi, in terms of how the Biden administration may be reevaluating our relationship with countries in the Middle East. So I think that the UAE move was quite clever in recapturing the imagination of the Biden foreign policy advisors after the UAE's reputation has taken a big hit because of Yemen, because of Libya, and because of being seen as so close to Mohammed bin Salman, and who is not a very popular character in the Democratic foreign policy establishment for a number of reasons, including the Khashoggi murder. So I think that you will see a Biden administration reevaluating our relationships in the Middle East, and it's not as though we can turn back to 2015, 2016, which wasn't exactly a great happy relationship between the Gulf and the Obama administration anyway, because of the Iran deal. But I don't see you're going to see a complete U.S. turning of the back to our traditional allies in order to embrace Iran. There's you were earlier sort of talking about the French concerns about Turkey's influence in Lebanon. I think the French see Turks under every bed. Like the Egyptians see Muslim Brotherhood under every bed. The Emiratis see Muslim Brotherhood under every bed. But there's too many American foreign policy thinkers who see Iranians under every bed.
I think a lot of people in this region also see Iran under every bed, but that's a different ballgame. But my question would be really, what would a Biden win mean for the attitude towards Iran, but also towards Syria and Lebanon as well? I mean, just more, if you could just give us a hint of where you would see a significant change or departure.
I mean,
other than resuscitating the JCPOA in a different format, of course.
I mean, I would like to say that there would be a Lebanon policy, but I'm not sure there will be. I think Lebanon will revert back to Lebanon being a subset of the Israel policy, Lebanon being a subset of the Syria policy, Lebanon being a subset of the Iran policy. I think that period when I happened to be ambassador in Lebanon I was fortunate because there was a Lebanon policy that George W. Bush had with Jacques Chirac. I don't see a comprehensive, focused Lebanon policy as being a top priority of a new Biden administration, given the problems we have in the world. Lebanon will be a subset of these regional issues. I think that the Biden administration will try to find a way to use diplomatic channels to constrain or to address the problems that the Americans have with Iran. And the problems the Americans have with Iran does overlap with the problems that the regional actors have. But I don't think that they will use sanctions only. I think that there will be an attempt to rebuild alliances in a way that you could have a unified dialogue with Iran to address some of these issues. Part of the Biden administration's foreign policy is going to have to be rebuilding the types of partnerships that not only did we have for the JCPOA, but that we had in the Pacific, and how you deal with expansionary China, of the sorts of policies that we had after the Russian annexation of Crimea. These partnerships have all withered under the Trump administration or been purposely undermined. And so I think you're going to see the Biden administration try to rebuild the relationships globally to address challenges such as Iran. And that means that as much as we may say we're tired of being in the Middle East, we're overinvested in the Middle East, we've made so many mistakes in the Middle East, what are the results been of our interventions in the Middle East? We're not going to turn our backs to the Middle East because we're going to need to have Middle Eastern allies as part of our attempt to engage Iran constructively in a way that Iran should decide to start changing its behavior. But I have to emphasize that the first focus the Biden administration is going to have, if Biden wins in November, as I certainly hope he does, will be domestic. Foreign policy is not going to be the very top of the agenda.
Okay. So not to expect change very quickly. Let me move to you, Hoshyar. Do you agree? I mean, in other words, do you think that the Biden win? How would the Biden win impact the U.S. policy in Iraq, both towards Iraq but also towards Iran?
Well, we are a few weeks of 3rd of November elections, and everybody is watching that very closely, and it affects every country. I mean, this is a fact. Although reading John Bolton books or finishing it recently, it really is frightening how this administration thinks about foreign policy and decision making, and its disinterest in the region as a whole. And Biden knows the region. He has worked with us for many years. From Congress to his role as a vice president with Obama, so he's familiar with many of the issues. He knows many of the personalities of the region he has dealt with, and definitely he will not disengage from the region, as Jeff said. Definitely, he will have his foreign policy and the region at least stabilized before making any drastic changes. But I personally believe his win will try to ease the pressure, or the maximum pressure on Iran. This is my understanding, my knowledge, which Biden was part of that process of the nuclear deal, and this is one. Secondly, I personally think that we don't know, we don't have the crystal ball who will win this election, but really it will be very interesting. It will be a close call, and So we have to wait. I don't have to make any predictions, but we have worked very closely with Biden for many, many years, and we know him, his attitude, his views. We think he has many, many, many positive points on the region as a whole because of his knowledge, his background. So let's wait and see.
Just hope we don't wait far longer than November 3rd. Marwan, let me turn to you, maybe with a question on Jordan. We are seeing, I mean, Jordan has been under lockdown for quite some time, but we're also seeing an uptick. It's also a country that is in the eye of the storm, so to speak. Anything that happens on the Israeli-Palestinian front impacts Jordan. It wasn't very happy with these unilateral deals. There was talk of population transfers at one point. And the country itself is in dire economic situation at a time when the entire region also has seen a significant downturn. And there is significant unrest in the country. Where is Jordan going, and how do you see it? How do you see things developing, given the broader regional tensions and developments in Syria, more specifically?
Well, on the domestic front, Jordan might be typical of many oil importing countries. In the sense that the system has lost its traditional tools to keep, social peace. These tools were either the security services, which were employed not just in Jordan but in many other countries, and financial tools, which were the product of oil resources in the form of either grants from Gulf countries, in the form of remittances of Jordanians working in the Gulf, or in the form of investments by the Gulf in Jordanian industries and the economy. All these tools are gone. 2011 have weakened, if you will, the grip of the security services. People are no longer as afraid of security services as they were before. 2014, and then of course COVID-19 on top of that, meant that oil resources are no longer there. Each country is on its own. We haven't received a single penny from the Gulf in over 5 years. Being on your own is not an economic sort of principle. It's also a political one, because you are not going to be able to tell people, we need your money now because we don't have financial resources that we used to have, but we want to keep you out of the political process. People are increasingly saying, not just in Jordan, but in many countries around the region, if you want your money, you're going to get our voice also. And without our voice, without us being participants in the decision-making process, we're sorry, we're not going to give you our money. So what I'm afraid of is this next phase in Jordan, but in many other countries in the Arab world as such. The system has to rethink not just its economic policies, but its political ones as well. The prevalent sort of feeling among the ruling establishment in Jordan has been that the cost of reform outweighs not doing it. And therefore, we better stay in the status quo, because undergoing a reform process is going to lead the country to more turmoil than not. I and many others, of course, subscribe to the opposite. You simply cannot afford not having political reform, because political reform today is what will keep the social peace. Without political reform, the economic conditions in the country are such that social peace will not be maintained if the system keeps asking people for their money without allowing them a more meaningful voice in running their affairs. Then on top of all that comes the Arab-Israeli issue. Of course, Jordan is very afraid that if there is no Palestinian state on Palestinian soil, and if Israel also is not interested in keeping a majority of Palestinians under its control, as I have stated before, today you have 6,900,000 Palestinians in Israel proper, the West Bank, Jerusalem, and Gaza, as opposed to 6.6 million Israeli Jews. Today you have a Palestinian majority in areas under Israel's control. If Israel does not accept a Palestinian state, a credible and viable Palestinian state, and if it doesn't want a majority of Palestinians staying under its control, the third option is clear, is forced expulsion of Palestinians somehow. We used to say this in today's age, this is not possible. You cannot have mass expulsion of people. But the Syrian crisis has taught us otherwise. 6.5 million Syrians left Syria in 6 months. So that fear, which at one point in history was depicted as exaggerated by Jordan, today you cannot say that anymore. And today Jordan is in a tight spot because it sees plans such as the Trump plan or the deal with the UAE and Bahrain. It sees it as undermining the road to a two-state solution. And at the same time, it cannot openly oppose the United States or Bahrain or the UAE, with which it enjoys good relations. So the country is in a very, very tight spot. It has limited options. And the way to address these options so far has been to do nothing, to maintain the status quo and to hope for better times.
What about, there is a question from the audience about the economic coalition between Jordan, Egypt, and Iraq. If you recall, a while back, there were some meetings, but I don't think it took place, or I don't think anything came out at the time following those meetings. No,
that was the Arab Cooperation Council. Yemen was also part of it. But
no,
look,
there were meetings between the three. I remember there were meetings between Jordan, Egypt, and Iraq at a certain moment.
There are certainly attempts, as Hoshyar said. There are certainly attempts to have more economic integration. In my view, it is not, one reason is Iran, as Hoshyar said, but another reason is all the studies have shown that economic integration among Arab countries is going to raise economic growth. Let's remember that in a post-COVID-19 environment, we are competing for funds from the whole world. Everybody wants funds. You don't have Saudi Arabia to bail you out anymore. And so you have to look for alternative schemes by which to increase growth. Economic integration is one of these schemes. And I hope it extends to more than just the three countries. I hope it extends to the rest of the Arab world as well.
Thank you, Tarek. Let me turn to you. We have some time left. I think I'll turn to you with the final question and then ask everybody for some closing remarks, which is Syria. We haven't talked about Syria. If we're talking about geopolitical tensions in the region, I think Syria is the one place where they materialize in horrific ways, I would say. Where do you see the prospects for moving forward in Syria are, and what are the regional impacts on Iraq, on Jordan, on Lebanon? There's a constitutional committee now that is supposed to be meeting under the auspices of the UN with Geir Pedersen, but that seems to have been stalled. All the challenges, COVID-19, the Russians, the Turks. Southern Syria seems to be going in one direction, northern Syria and another. You have the areas under the international coalition. So where do you see things moving in Syria or unraveling?
Well, you rightly said that the Geneva process, the discussion on the constitution, is slow and will not bring about any significant political change. as the regime's position has not changed on its willingness to make any concessions. I mean, we all know that the regime like Assad's regime thinks that any concession, no matter how small it is, will bring its fall, and therefore continues to be intransigent. Every discussion on the constitution has shown how intransigent are the members of the delegation of the Syrian government. So there isn't much hope in that, but it's good to keep the process alive until better times come. When do these better times come? I don't know, but we all know that the regime is getting weaker because of its inability to deliver on the economy. It has not been able also to succeed in its demographic engineering, in spite of the 3 million displaced persons and the 3.5 million refugees outside Syria. The map of Syria's demography hasn't radically changed, and it's been extremely difficult for the regime to make irreversible changes at that level. What a game changer could be is a clearer disagreement between Russia and Iran. Everybody has been announcing that the Russians and the Iranians are not on the same page, they have different agendas, and that the Russians have a greater leverage on the regime, and therefore will end up limiting Iranian influence. There have been a few indicators that favor this thesis, but nothing significant has happened so far. The Russians have been quite silent on this. I think they are waiting. This is how the Russian diplomacy has been operating in Syria for a good while. They're waiting for the West, as they say. I think they mean the US, to talk to them about Iran, and they're waiting for a trade-off. I mean, we part ways in Syria, but what do we get in exchange? And this trade-off has not happened. There are no indications that it will ever happen, because the Americans have withdrawn from Syria, no matter if the American soldiers left. Europe is too weak to make any deal on Syria with anyone, let alone with Russia. So we might have to wait until we see a change in Russian-Iranian relations. Now the Turks are so obsessed about the Kurdish issue that they see Syria now from that prism, and from that prism alone. And therefore they lost a chance they seem to have some time ago to be a major actor, a major broker of a political solution in Syria. I doubt that Turkey might be able to play that role. I haven't answered your questions. How could I?
Thank you for trying at least. No, that was a good. So I'm going to ask. There's a question from the audience to you, Jeff, from Jumana. Sorry, 1 second. Just having to move the cursor. Jumana Haber, basically asking if the French initiative fails, as it seems to be failing right now, is the US going to leave Lebanon to its own devices, i.e. descent into hell, more or less? I'm paraphrasing. So I will end with this question to you, but if you also want to tag onto it, any final remarks, and then I will ask Marwan, Tarek, and Hoshyar also for some final remarks before we close this panel. So over to you, Jeff.
I mean, unfortunately, I think this is the absolute worst possible time for Lebanon to try to attract the attention of the very senior leaders in Washington. For all the reasons.
You don't think we have their full attention now with all the sanctions coming down?
I think, I mean, you have the attention of some people, but it's not the type of sustained attention that would lead to the type of policy meetings, come up with a comprehensive approach to help Lebanon. But I think it's worth noting that while the economic reforms in Lebanon are absolutely essential, the sorts of things that people on the street were demanding starting in October, they aren't sufficient. Maybe economic reforms, if President Macron's leadership, working with the Lebanese, helps to promote the economic reforms, perhaps that will unlock some of the IMF support. Perhaps that will unlock the old CEDRA funds. That, of course, can help. But as long as you have two fundamental problems in Lebanon on top of the economic issues, Lebanon's not going to be on a sustainable footing. One is the political system. The political system, which led to the economic problems, has to have a fundamental change in my view, and that seems to be what the Lebanese people are saying. It's not Jeff Feltman saying there needs to be a fundamental political system change. It's the Lebanese people who have said that. And the second thing is the Lebanese somehow are going to have to deal with the fact that there is a militia in their midst that has no accountability for its military activities, that can drag Lebanon into war at its will, or can veto any decision that the government or parliament might take because of the power of its arms. That Hezbollah question is going to have to be dealt with. So you have three issues: the economic reforms, the political system changes, and the fact of Hezbollah's arms. They're interconnected, but for Lebanon to have a sustainable future that attracts the type of foreign engagement investment that would take advantage of Lebanese talent, the Lebanese people are such a resource, you're going to have to deal with all three of those issues. My final comment, if I may, back to the Iran question. Trump pulled out of the JCPOA back in spring of 2018, May of 2018, if I'm correct. And we have to ask: Is Iran any less aggressive? Is the region any safer because of Trump pulling out of that agreement? I would say no, arguably no. Lots of facts to point that up. I think that the mistakes that the Obama made with the JCPOA were twofold. One, the administration did not consult sufficiently with the region. So the region, whether it's Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Israel, etc., was suspicious about what was going on because there was a lack of transparency with countries that were close to us. The second thing, though, was that at too many times the Obama administration, and particularly the Secretary of State, John Kerry at the time, overplayed the JCPOA. The JCPOA was designed to address one issue, which was Iran's nuclear program. It was not designed to solve the regional issues, which are also of our concern. But sometimes the administration talked as though this was opening the door to the type of U.S.-Iranian dialogue that could address these issues. I don't think that was ever the case. The U.S. should have stayed focused on what the JCPOA did do, which was address the nuclear issue, and then pivot to trying to come up with diplomacy and alliances on how to deal with the regional aspects of Iran's behavior.
Thank you, Jeff. Hoshyar, let me turn to you for some final remarks and whether you agree with Jeff's reading of policy towards Iran, which has obviously a direct impact on Iraq as well.
No, I agree with Jeff a great deal. But from where we are, actually, I think the world is changing. And this maximum pressure on Iran has affected them a great deal. Economically, it undermined their economy, the spread of COVID-19, and also the loss of one of their greatest heroes, Qasem Soleimani, who was instrumental in Iran foreign policies in the region as a whole. We see actually the Iranian are also having this debate to see where they are going, indeed, to have a normalized relation with the international community, with the neighborhood, or to go on about their expansionist schemes and policies. They are at that stage. But I think the world is changing. The Middle East is changing also. Today I'm just watching the CNN trying to bring this festivities, as Marwan said. I think this is a turning point. Despite the views many of us, imagine Marwan or Tarek, the last Arab League session, the Palestinians were alone. And could you ever have imagined a Palestinian resolution not to pass the Arab League Council? Never. I could have imagined, you see, a few years ago. But this is happening. And the other thing is really this American election is dominating everybody's thinking, where the dice is going, how it will change, because although after COVID-19, as many friends said, there would be inward looking by the American, by the European, but still the Middle East, I think, will be there, you see. I mean, they will not withdraw or depart or to have a pivot to Asia or elsewhere. No, I think there still will be commitment, maybe not as strong as before, but in different forms.
Thank you, Hoshyar. Marwan, over to you. Misk al-Khitam. Any last minute comments or thoughts?
But I just want to say, Maha, the geopolitical tensions in the region are taking place in a vacuum of leadership that the Arab world is going through, which has allowed non-Arab countries like Iran or Turkey or others, the United States, to come in and interfere in a major way. The Arab world needs to understand, and it hasn't yet, that it has to rethink its political and economic policies, that it has to rethink its relationship with its citizens, that it cannot go on with the tools of the 20th century to address the problems of the 21st century. You have to start talking about inclusion and democracy and political systems and systems of checks and balances and treating people as citizens, not subjects, and having a proper education system. These are all issues that you can no longer ignore except at your own peril. And today, it is true, you mentioned the fact that the United States is pivoting to other regions. It's not just the United States. I mean, we are taking ourselves outside human development through insisting on policies that just no longer work.
Thank you, Marwan. I think we just lost Tarek. Anyhow, we're at the end of what has been a fascinating discussion. We're obviously in for more turmoil in the region, unfortunately, beginning with Lebanon, but not ending there. But we have to hope for the best. I want to thank first Meisha Dia and the Meisha Dia Foundation for organizing this, for asking me to moderate this fantastic discussion. And I look forward to seeing all of you soon in one way or the other. So thank you, Marwan, Hoshyar, Jeff, and Tarek, who I think has already left. Have a lovely evening, everyone.
Let's watch the ceremony, okay?